Hi, I'm John Montgomery, and welcome to FX PhD and this bonus class at keeping your imagery clean in the DVE module or the action module in Flame. A lot of things I'm going to be talking about now with the unification between the products apply to both. This is something I've noticed in traveling around and talking to people, that there's not always a clear understanding of what's going on with the anti-aliasing setups and so forth within DVE, and also how to maintain the quality and clean imagery that you get. There's this idea that you go into the DVE and crank things up to 64 samples and it's going to be great, gorgeous imagery, but that's actually not the case at all. So I thought what I'd do, instead of taking up time in a class, we thought we'd provide you with this bonus class as a little added bonus for those of you taking the course, into kind of how this anti-aliasing impacts the quality of the imagery that you do in action in the DVE module. Let's go ahead and start. And what I've got is this setup here where I've got a flowers image. We'll go ahead and then some geometry that I created of the FX PhD logo. We'll go ahead and hide that. And all I'm going to do, I've got this cropped with 5 at each side. I'm going to go ahead and take that and rotate it around. And then let's go ahead and zoom in on it and take a look at the edges. So it looks good here now, but the minute I hit preview, which is obviously previewing the render, you can see that I get this really hard, jaggy edge. Really unacceptable if you're combining imagery and so forth. But if you go ahead and then turn up anti-aliasing samples to 64 and hit preview, you can see now I've got a nicer, softer blending edge on this as well. So what anti-aliasing is useful for doing is actually cleaning up the edges of imagery like this, such as an image layer. And we'll go ahead now and let's take a look at this, and you can see that as well with our imagery here, the FX PhD logo. I'll go ahead and switch this back to one sample and hit preview, and you can see how ratty that actually looks. If I crank this up to 64 and hit preview, you can see it actually gets much cleaner. I'm at a weird zoom level there. But if I go and hit home here, you can see that there's 64 samples, and then one, you can see much rattier. So higher anti-aliasing samples are good for the edges of imagery, cleaning up the edges of imagery and the edges of geometry. Also, let's just go ahead and say, I'll go ahead and hide this again. I've got the logo here. I'm going to go ahead and add this as an image and then shrink this down. And if we have rendering set at one sample, you can see that that image ends up being pretty ratty. It's still not anti-aliasing, no anti-aliasing on that. And we go up to 64 samples and hit preview. You can see now that I've got nice clean edges on that resized logo. So if you're shrinking something or repositioning it not on a pixel, that's where anti-aliasing is good as well. So again, we've got edges, we've got reduced size and resampling, and we've got edges of geometry. Were very useful uses of anti-aliasing. But now let's talk a little bit about the dirty secret of anti-aliasing. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and load in my flowers in the background. So I got the same image in the background as I do in the foreground. This is reset at 100. Let's go ahead and zoom in. I'm going to go in here really tight and take a look at some of this fine detail. So this is our background image and our front. So we'll take a look at this now. And what I'll do is go ahead and just hit, with one sample, hit preview. So we compare the result and the back, and you can already see that we're getting a little bit of softness there. Let's go ahead and crank the samples up to 64. Notice it gets even softer and blurrier. So there's our back and there's our result. And you can kind of see now that you can have some really poor impact on things if you just willy-nilly, as I like to say, switch things over to 64 samples. So what's happening with this sampling? What's going on here? Well, under the hood, with anti-aliasing, is the camera ends up exposing the scene a certain number of times by shifting it, jittering it, in X and Y. And the number of times it does this is determined by the sample values here. So with sample 1, it's taking effectively one snapshot. And with 64, it's taking 64 and averaging those. And the distance, in other words, the distance between each of these samples that's moving, is determined by the softness value. So if I crank softness up to 81 here, you can see what's happening. It's actually creating a huge, giant distance between them. The default value here is 1. And you can actually take that down to 0.5 as well. Now 0.5 is useful, and we'll show you in a bit. You can actually reduce the amount of softness that's happening by just hitting 0.5. So if there's the 0.5 at 6 samples, and then 1, you can see that's a little softer. It's a subtle change, but again, if you want to, you can do this, and this is really useful for higher resolution imagery, and I'll show you that here in a second. So what's the bottom line? Use as few samples as you can, and if you can, lower your softness down to even 0.5. First bottom line, cranking up to 64 doesn't necessarily equal good. Well, there is thankfully a way around some of these issues, and let's go ahead and start out with an image because that's the easiest to see. I'll go ahead and add an image for this layer. And all we need to do is to come down here and turn off this filtering button in order to keep our imagery clean. We'll go to Setup, and I'll crank this up to 64 samples. And let's go ahead and bring this guy in here so we can see our logo. And we'll go ahead and zoom in here so we can see both the edges and so forth. If I change this to one sample and hit preview, you can see we have hard edges here on the FX PhD logo. But if we look, again, I have this image up, you can actually see that the quality of the rendered image here in my foreground hasn't changed. This is an image here, 100% or fully opaque, and it's being rendered with one sample, and it matches the background. We'll go ahead and crank this up to 64. We can see we get nice smooth edges here on the FX PhD logo, but our image now is much softer. Well, we can get around that at NTSC resolution by going to our image object here and turning off filtering. And if I turn off filtering, this will bypass the OpenGL bilinear filtering. So I'll go ahead now, I'm at 64 samples, and we'll hit preview. And now if we take a look, we have this nice FX PhD logo geometry, has nice edges, and our image quality has not been softened. It is actually the same as the background image. So no softening in our image at NTSC resolution with filtering off. So that can be incredibly useful, say in that example the other week when I was going ahead and doing grading and so forth, and you have a separate layer and you don't want it to soften, you want to make sure you turn filtering off for that layer if you're not moving it. If you shrink it down now, you will have problems. So if I shrink this down and hit preview, you can see it's actually quite ratty. It looks sharp, but it actually ends up being not a very good render when it's done because there's no anti-aliasing, similar to what we saw with that FX PhD logo before. So that's not good. But as long as you move your position in X or Y in 1 pixel increments, in other words, in this case we've got 2741, and hit preview, it's going to look okay. But the minute you go to 27.5, the nearest 27.5 or whatever, something 0.5, the nearest neighbor kind of filtering is not going to work anymore. So if you turn filtering off, make sure that you move it in even units. In this case, 27 by 41 works fine. Filtering off for images that are stationary or in those kind of increments. You can also unable to animate an object because most likely, well, if you're lucky in every single frame that you animated on, it hits an integer, then you'd be okay, but generally that's not going to happen. It's going to land in between those at 0.5, 0.2, something like that. So you don't want to be animating your image at that point. One other thing I want to mention as well while we're here is if I'm just leaving this at its default position, okay, I just want to say, okay, we'll go ahead and 0, 0. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and delete this axis, and that will remind me that I have filtering off on this image. Just a good little quick tip that I know that if I want to move that, I better turn filtering back on. So that's imagery. That's pretty simple, but let's take a look at DVE. So I'm going to go ahead and add a DVE object for this layer. And I'll go ahead and move it down. And this is where some of the stuff that we talked about in the DVE module, why I like the clarity of using source nodes. So let's go ahead and zoom in here. And if I select the DVE, turn filtering off, go to setup, and hit preview, I'm going to expect my image here to retain its clarity. But if we look at the background, you can see that even though I have filtering off on my DVE, I'm still getting this blurriness. Well, that's because, actually, what's going on under here? Let's go ahead. We'll take this, expand the DVE, and it's, again, that source node that we showed in a previous class. And if I look at the front source node here, you can actually see that that front source node is set at 64 samples. Okay, and filtering is on that image. So what we want to do is we have to make sure that filtering is off on that. And then if we do undo, it gets grouped back together. But thanks to a little quirk in the software, if we expand this again and take a look at this, filtering actually remains off. The undo doesn't influence that. So now if we take a look at this, we hit preview, compare it with a rendered result with our back, we're actually maintaining that same kind of image quality with no softness. So again, that's a caveat in using these DVE modules you have to be aware of. This trick of turning off filtering, at least in the current implementation, doesn't seem to impact things that in the way that you'd want to. In my thinking, actually, the filtering here, if you turn off filtering on this main layer, you'd want to go ahead and have filtering off on this source node as well. Of course, the other thing you could do is come in here as well, turn that down to 1 sample, and expand that back. And then I believe you should be fine as well if you don't turn off filtering. But again, the main thing is to go ahead, turn filtering on off that way, and then undo. To me, that's kind of a workaround, and you can be doing some softening without really understanding or realizing what's going on in your processing pipeline. And by using explicit source nodes and images and axes, it does become much clearer. That being said, as we discussed in the forums and so forth, a great feature here is to be able to select this DVE, do a copy, and get a duplicate of it with all your settings duplicated here in your layer menu, in your media menu. That's actually really incredibly useful and something that as a longtime Action user is pretty cool to see, because you can always duplicate as a DVE and then go back and change it back to an imagery if you want as well to do that. So now this may be incredibly obvious to some of you, but it's actually not to everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete some of these things here. And we're going to talk about really quickly reentry and parenting. So I'm going to take this DVE object and we'll go ahead and add this. And let's scale this down to, say, 50%. Let's just take it down to 25%. And you've got it set up the way that you want to do. Now, what I have actually seen people do in Smoke without actually understanding fully what they're doing is going ahead and, say, adding another DVE object, but say turning on reentry now and reentering this into this layer. And it's actually a really bad thing to do. So go ahead and take that and add that and then add the mat to that. And what they might do is then take this re-entered item here, and I think I need to turn the mat on. There we go. And then they would actually take this and scale it back up in size, which is obviously a no-no. Not something that you'd want to do for any reason, because of course, as we know from looking at the DVE objects last week, these are again source nodes. So what you're effectively doing here is you're effectively processing action setup twice when doing that. And that's far different from undo, far different than, say, doing something like this, where I'll go ahead and add the FXPHD image. I will say scale it down to 25%, add another axis to that, and scale the axis back up. As you can see, there's no loss of quality whatsoever because I'm, of course, scaling it twice. And effectively, these two transforms are concatenated, much like they are, I guess, within a shake graph or within other applications. Here it's doing it within action before it's being rendered, so these are becoming additive. And then if you want to do that, then you would re-enter that as well. But again, just a reminder that if you're doing that positioning and repositioning within DVE objects, you can actually degrade your image quite considerably when working without knowing why that's happening. It should be fairly obvious to you in most cases on the screen if you're doing a dramatic reduction or increase in size. But there are subtle changes at times where you might just be better served doing it a simpler way out here in the action schematic. So let's go ahead and reset everything and just add in about a 2K image here. There's a front. Make sure my mat is off. And I'll go ahead and add, just for simplicity as we saw, I'm going to go ahead and add an image to it. Let's change my 1024 and with the height. Okay, so there we go. I've got the 2048 by 1024 image in default position, keyed over the background. They're just layered over the background. If we go in here, we can see we'll leave everything normal. One sample, one softness, preview. Back and result look good at one sample. Crank up to 64. Takes a little bit longer, but you can see we have some issues. If I go ahead and now turn off filtering and hit preview, it's still actually quite blurry in comparison to the background. And this is where I told you that we need to take the softness down to 0.5 to make it work at, say, I don't know, it's around 1280 by 720. I'll have to admit in this case I don't know the exact size. I'm sure it has to do with the OpenGL buffer memory that Discrete's using, the tiles they're using on their geometry. If I do 0.5 and now hit preview, you can see that there's my back and my front. I have no softness. So that's how you do it when you're at a higher resolution image at this level of 2K, around HD resolution and higher. That's what you want to do. Now you may ask, okay, but what about my geometry at softness of 0.5? Let's go ahead and add in the nodes of this geometry. I must have ZBuffer and take this all the way down to the bottom. There we go. So let's go ahead and zoom in here. If we take our 64 samples and hit preview now, you can see that I get nice clean edges on the FXPHD geometry. Go ahead and hit preview again, a little closer up. That's actually because I'm not an even number. It's not going to look great. So we'll do preview and then compare that result with the back, and you can see that the imagery here stays nice and sharp, which is my image, and my geometry has nice smooth edges on it. So your softness down here at 0.5 when you're dealing with such things. So let's recap what I talked about in this special class. First of all, anti-aliasing, what does it do? It effectively exposes the scene n times, where n is the number of samples. In other words, and the distance between those exposures is a softness value. So effectively taking multiple pictures of your scene and then averaging them together to come up with that nicer anti-aliased edges. The uses for anti-aliasing, it's good for edges of layers, edges of rotated mats, anti-aliasing geometry, and cleaning up objects reduced in size. Bottom line is it doesn't inherently make your images prettier. And in fact, it can do, as you saw today, quite the opposite. In order to avoid image softness when you're working, keep the anti-aliasing settings as low as possible. Okay? Turn filtering off for static or 100% sized images. And if you need to move them in integer units. Set the softness to 0.5 for higher res setups in order to maintain that quality while turning filtering off. And also consider using source nodes to render only certain parts of a scene at a higher anti-aliasing value, leaving your main action setup rendered at, say, one sample. Generally, I'll try and do all the work that I can at one sample anti-aliasing. And obviously, if you have 3D geometry in your scene, that's going to be pretty much impossible. But again, a good rule to follow, keep it low. And a few more things. Use your linked axes to transform objects. In other words, you don't want to scale imagery multiple times in reentry. And then be aware of the additional anti-aliasing settings inside your DVE objects, because those hidden settings inside there can actually add up to degrading your imagery, and you really don't want that to happen. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this kind of technical or useful look at maintaining image quality when you're working inside the DVE or action modules. Thanks again for being part of FXPHD, and if you have any questions, be sure to drop by the forums and post them there. Thanks for watching.